I'm super curious. How much is everybody spending in groceries each month? We're probably doing about $1,700 a month. It's nuts.
God, look at these prices. $3.99 for a little small tub of cream cheese. That's the deal. That's the lowest price.
You're getting scammed and you don't even know it.
What the fuck? They scamming out here.
You see how it says 1.709? It's 1.506.
A woman from Amsterdam was standing in a Walmart in Georgia when she watched a store manager pull an entire shipment of ham off the shelves. On the spot. No call to corporate, no approval needed. A shopper had just proven the label was wrong. It said nearly 5 pounds. The scale said 1.83. She'd lived in 3 countries. She'd never seen a company move that fast on its own mistake, and it wasn't corporate policy that made it happen. It was one manager deciding alone. That's the part that stuck with her, and it's the part most people miss. The story everyone already assumes is that Walmart got caught. That's not actually the interesting piece. The interesting piece is everything that happened next. A refund with no questions asked. A $45 million lawsuit most shoppers have never heard of. A legal system built specifically so a $3 complaint can turn into a 7-figure settlement. None of that was ordered from the top. It was already built into the system, waiting. So this isn't a story about Walmart getting something wrong. Companies get things wrong everywhere. This is about the machinery that kicks in the moment they do. Quietly, automatically, decades in the making, and what it reveals about how deep it actually runs, once you know where to look. The woman from Amsterdam wasn't the only one confused that day. Marcus Webb, the shopper who'd started it all, stood there just as puzzled, not by what he'd found, but by how little anyone seemed to know about who was supposed to catch it. He asked the manager a simple question. Was there someone whose job it was to check these weights before they reached the shelf? The manager didn't have a clean answer. Nobody at store level did. And that gap between a number printed on a label and the actual verification of that number is older and stranger than either of them realized. Most people assume weight fraud is illegal because common sense says it should be. That's not quite how it works. It's illegal because in 1901, the United States didn't have a single national standard for what a pound of anything actually meant at the point of sale. States set their own rules. Some didn't set any. A merchant in one county could sell a pound of flour that weighed 12 ounces, and a customer had no real recourse beyond an argument at the counter. Congress created the National Bureau of Standards that year, not because of some abstract commitment to fairness, but because interstate commerce was becoming unmanageable without a shared definition of a unit. Trade needed a common language before trust could exist inside it. What grew out of that, eventually formalized as NIST Handbook 133, is not a law in the way most people picture law. It's a technical manual, revised almost every year, specifying exactly how a package should be weighed, how much variance is legally tolerable per product category, how to weight for packaging materials gets subtracted, and what counts as a violation versus a rounding artifact. Ground beef has a different allowable tolerance than a bag of chips. A whole roast is judged differently than a pre-sliced deli item. Almost no shopper has ever read a page of it. Almost every package in an American store is, legally speaking, shaped by it. Enforcement runs through each state's own weights and measures office, an agency most Americans couldn't name if asked. Inspectors carry certified scales into stores unannounced, pull random packages off shelves, and test them against the label. They have the authority to fine a store, order a batch pulled, or refer a pattern of violations for further investigation. It is by design decentralized and largely invisible. It's built to work quietly in the background, catching errors before they compound, not to reassure anyone that it's there. But invisible enforcement has a cost that rarely gets discussed. A system designed to work unnoticed only gets credit when something breaks loudly enough to force attention onto it. For most of the past century, that's exactly what happened. Violations got caught in routine inspections, corrected, fined, forgotten. Nobody filmed it. Nobody needed to. The system was doing what it was built to do, off camera, the way most functioning infrastructure does. What changed wasn't the law. It was who got there first. A regulator with a certified scale finds a violation before a single customer ever sees the shelf. A shopper with a phone finds it after thousands of packages have already been sold. And unlike the regulator, he has an audience. The Georgia produce scale that flagged the ham wasn't part of any inspection program. It was public equipment, meant for weighing loose tomatoes, repurposed by one curious person who happened to notice something felt wrong in his hand. The law had been there the entire time. What was missing wasn't the rule. It was someone checking before the damage was already done. That's the quieter question underneath the whole incident. Not whether America has a system for catching this. It clearly does, and has for over a century. The question is, how much of that system actually functions the way it was designed to, and how much of it now depends on the accident of someone paying closer attention than they had to. A retail worker from Berlin, 3 months into a job at an American grocery chain, watched a customer walk up to the service counter with a half-eaten container of strawberries and ask for her money back. No receipt, no explanation beyond these weren't good. The associate refunded her in under a minute, tossed the container, and moved to the next customer like nothing unusual had happened. The German employee stood there longer than the transaction lasted. Where she'd trained, a return meant a manager, a form, and usually a conversation about proof of purchase. Here, it meant almost nothing had to be proven at all. She assumed at first that this was generosity, a company choosing to be kind to its customers. That's the natural read, and it's not quite right. What she was watching wasn't kindness. It was the tail end of a decades-old arms race that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with survival. The instinct traces back to the early 20th century, when American department stores were multiplying faster than customers could develop loyalty to any single one of them. Marshall Fields, and later Nordstrom, discovered something counterintuitive. A store that took back anything, for any reason, no argument, kept customers coming back more than a store that fought over every return. The logic wasn't moral, it was competitive. If refusing a return cost you a customer for life, and granting it cost you the price of a shirt, the math wasn't close. That policy spread not because regulators required it, federal law actually sets no baseline return requirement at all, but because refusing to match a competitor's generosity became a fast way to lose market share. By the time big box retail scaled the model nationally in the second half of the century, no questions asked wasn't a courtesy. It was table stakes. That history explains the moment at the counter, but it doesn't make the policy costless, and pretending otherwise flattens the real picture. Retailers lose an estimated tens of billions of dollars a year in the US to return fraud alone. Wardrobing, where someone buys an item, uses it once and returns it. Receipt fraud, organized rings that exploit lenient policies at scale across multiple store locations. Some of that cost gets absorbed quietly by margins. A meaningful amount of it gets passed forward, embedded in prices every other customer pays without ever knowing it. The convenience one shopper enjoys at the counter is, in a very literal sense, subsidized by everyone else who never asks for a refund at all. Retailers know this, and the response hasn't been to abandon the model. It's been to make it quietly more selective. Return tracking software now flags customers who return too often, too fast, or with patterns that resemble fraud, sometimes banning them from future returns without ever explaining why. The friendliest looking policy in retail runs, underneath, on some of the most aggressive consumer surveillance in the industry. The frictionless experience at the counter and the algorithm deciding who's allowed to keep having it are the same system, just visible from two different sides. So the German employee wasn't wrong to notice something real. The instinct she saw, extend trust first, worry about the exceptions later, is genuinely embedded in how American retail operates. And it did originate from real competitive pressure, not corporate mythology. But it isn't generosity in the way it first appears, and it isn't free. It's a calculated bet, run at national scale, that trusting people costs less than doubting them. A bet that still requires a quiet second system, running in the background to catch the people the first one was never meant to cover. A journalist visiting from London sat in on what she expected to be a minor local story, a shopper's viral video about mislabeled ham and found herself, a few clicks deep, reading about a $45 million settlement she'd never heard reported anywhere. Not because it had been hidden, because in the American legal landscape, a settlement that size for a consumer pricing dispute barely registers as news. She'd covered financial scandals in 3 countries. She couldn't recall a domestic equivalent where a company paid 8 figures over the price of packaged meat, quietly, without it becoming a national story. Her first assumption was that American consumers must be unusually litigious, quick to sue, primed by a culture that reaches for lawyers before conversation. That's the stereotype, and it misses what's actually mechanical about the system. Individual consumers rarely file these cases themselves, and rarely could afford to. What makes a $3 overcharge on a ham package turn into a multi-million-dollar settlement isn't outrage. It's a specific piece of legal architecture called the contingency fee, combined with a procedural tool called the class action. And neither one exists in most of the world the way it exists in the United States. The contingency fee model, formalized through the 20th century, lets a lawyer take a case for a client with no money up front, in exchange for a percentage, often around a third, of whatever the case eventually recovers. If the case loses, the lawyer earns nothing. That single arrangement flips the economics of legal access. A shopper who lost $15 on a mislabeled ham could never justify hiring a lawyer to fight for $15. But a law firm can justify representing 10,000 shoppers who each lost $15 because aggregated through a class action, that becomes a case worth pursuing and worth a company settling rather than litigating for years. The individual grievance was never the point. The aggregation is the entire mechanism. Most of Western Europe deliberately built its legal systems without this combination. Contingency fees are restricted or banned outright in a number of countries, seen as a conflict of interest. A lawyer financially incentivized in the outcome of a case rather than paid to advise on it. Collective redress mechanisms exist in the EU, but they're newer, narrower, and typically require a certified consumer organization to bring the case rather than a private law firm pursuing it for profit. The American model is faster and more aggressive specifically because it's driven by financial incentive, not by institutional gatekeeping. And that's precisely what critics inside the US object to. The criticism is not fringe. Legal scholars and business groups alike have spent decades arguing that class action settlements often deliver a windfall to the law firms that file them and comparatively little to the consumers they claim to represent. A $45 million settlement that translates, once divided across hundreds of thousands of claimants and after legal fees are subtracted, into a coupon or a check for a few dollars each. Some of these suits are filed not because a company caused serious harm, but because a technical violation creates leverage a firm can monetize. The mechanism built to protect small consumers is also, demonstrably, a business model, and sometimes those two things pull against each other. What the London journalist had stumbled onto then wasn't a culture of outrage, it was a piece of financial engineering, built specifically so that harm too small for any one person to fight for becomes worth fighting for once multiplied by everyone who experienced it the same way. It's neither pure justice nor pure exploitation. It's a tool, and like most tools built to correct one imbalance, it created a new one that nobody's fully resolved. A retail supervisor who transferred from a chain in France to manage a store outside Atlanta spent his first few weeks waiting for permission that never came. Back in France, pulling a product line off shelves that even, for a suspected labeling error, meant escalating through regional management, sometimes waiting a day or more for sign-off, because the decision carried legal and financial weight above his pay grade. In Georgia, he watched a shift manager 2 levels below him make that exact call in under a minute, based on nothing more than a customer's scale reading and his own judgment. Nobody above him was consulted. Nobody needed to be. His instinct was to read this as looseness. A company with weak oversight, letting frontline employees make decisions that should belong to people with more authority and more information. That instinct, reasonable as it sounds, gets the design backward. What he was watching wasn't an absence of control, it was a deliberate architecture, built over decades, specifically to push authority down rather than concentrate it at the top. The model traces back to how American retail scaled geographically in the mid-20th century. Chains like Walmart expanded into thousands of towns, often faster than any centralized system could realistically monitor in real time. The company that built its structure around waiting for headquarters to approve every local decision would have been paralyzed by its own size. So the model that emerged instead treated the store manager not as a middle management relay point, but as something closer to a franchise operator with real discretion, authority to mark down prices, pull inventory, handle customer disputes, and yes, remove suspect product, all without a call upstream. Sam Walton himself was explicit about this philosophy in his own writing. Push decisions to the person closest to the problem, because that person has information headquarters doesn't. And speed matters more than centralized certainty. That decentralization is exactly what let the Georgia manager act the way he did. But it's worth being precise about what it actually was. He wasn't authorized to investigate a supply chain failure or determine whether a labeling error was isolated or systemic. He had exactly one lever available to him: pull the product from his own shelves. Nothing about his authority reached upstream into the distribution center, the processing plant, or the corporate systems that had allowed the mislabeled batch to ship in the first place. Decentralization solved the local problem instantly and left the structural one completely untouched, a pattern that shows up whenever this system gets tested. That gap is precisely what critics of the model point to. A structure built for speed at the store level creates unevenness everywhere else. Two Walmart locations 100 miles apart can respond to functionally identical problems in completely different ways because the decision never has to pass through a shared filter. Internal audits and industry researchers have long noted that decentralized retail authority, while fast, produces inconsistent enforcement. A violation caught and corrected in one store can persist for weeks in another simply because no one there happened to notice. The very feature that made the French manager's counterpart move so fast is the same feature that let a defective batch travel through an entire national supply chain undetected in the first place. Speed at the edge and blindness at the center turned out to be the same design choice, viewed from two different distances. So the authority he witnessed wasn't a loophole or a sign of a company running loose. It was intentional, decades in the making, and genuinely effective at what it was built to do. What it was never built to do, and what nothing in that structure attempts to fix, is catch a problem before it reaches the person standing at the shelf in the first place. A media analyst from Stockholm watching the Kentucky Legends statement land online pulled up the timeline out of professional habit. Video posted, millions of views within days. Corporate statement issued before the week was out. In her experience covering European consumer scandals, that gap, incident to public corporate response, usually ran in weeks, sometimes months, filtered through legal review, translated across markets, cleared by communications teams operating on an entirely different clock. She wasn't used to watching a company respond at the speed of the outrage itself. Her first instinct was to credit American corporate culture, a business environment more responsive, more accountable, quicker to own its mistakes. That reading feels intuitive and doesn't survive much scrutiny. What she was actually watching wasn't a culture of accountability. It was a company managing exposure under conditions that didn't exist for most of its history, reacting to a mechanism that has nothing to do with conscience and everything to do with math. The shift traces to a specific, measurable change in how information moves. Before smartphones and social platforms, a defective product discovered by one shopper in one store stayed exactly that. A local complaint, maybe a letter to corporate, resolved or ignored with no public record either way. A company could sit on a problem for weeks without cost, because almost no one outside that single store would ever know it existed. That protection is gone. A single video, filmed on equipment every shopper already carries, can now reach millions of people within hours, independent of any journalist, regulator, or press release. The company no longer controls the timeline of when the public learns about a problem. It only controls how it responds once the public already knows. That change rewired the incentives underneath crisis response entirely. Silence, which used to be a safe default while a company quietly investigated internally, became its own liability. A brand that says nothing for a week while a video accumulates 10 million views isn't perceived as being careful. It's perceived as hiding. Communications teams and crisis consultants describe this shift explicitly. The modern standard isn't respond once you know the full truth. It's respond fast enough to control the narrative before someone else finishes writing it for you. Kentucky Legend's statement wasn't a company being unusually forthcoming. It was a company doing the only thing that still worked once the story was already out of its hands. But treating this as pure accountability misses the harder truth researchers who study corporate crisis response keep surfacing. Speed and sincerity are not the same thing, and the incentive structure explicitly rewards the former over the latter. A fast statement can be issued before an internal investigation is even complete, meaning companies are frequently apologizing for something they don't yet fully understand themselves, simply because waiting to understand it costs more, reputationally, than answering too early. Some crisis responses are engineered less to fix an underlying problem than to end a news cycle calibrated by the same metric that created the pressure in the first place. How quickly can attention move on to something else? The apology and the deflection can look, from the outside, identical. There's a deeper asymmetry underneath that the Swedish analyst's framing didn't quite capture either. This mechanism only activates when something goes viral, and virality is unpredictable, unevenly distributed, and frequently has nothing to do with how serious a problem actually is. A minor issue caught on a compelling video can trigger a national statement within days. A serious systemic issue that never gets filmed or gets filmed by someone with no following can persist for years without any public pressure at all. The system she watched respond so impressively wasn't a general commitment to transparency. It was a spotlight, powerful exactly where it happens to land, and completely dark everywhere else. What she'd actually witnessed, then, wasn't accountability built into American corporate culture. It was accountability built into a technology, retrofitted onto companies that had no real choice but to adapt to it. Fast, visible, and only as reliable as the next viral video deciding to exist. None of these 5 systems were built together, and none of them were built to work as one machine. A Waits law from 1901. A refund policy born out of department store competition. A legal tool designed to make small harms worth fighting. A management structure built for speed, not oversight. A public reckoning that only activates when a camera happens to be there. Nobody sat down and designed a country that catches its own mistakes. It just ended up, layer by accidental layer, with enough of them stacked on top of each other that most of the time, something catches. Most of the time isn't all of the time. Every one of these systems has a blind spot the others don't cover. And this story only exists because, for one moment, a scale happened to sit in the produce section and one shopper happened to trust his own hands more than the label in front of him. So maybe the real question isn't why this system caught what it caught. It's what's moving through the exact same supply chain right now, unfilmed, unweighed, waiting for someone who never comes.